Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Caitlin Karolenko. I am Program Manager at IFINS, the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Science. Today's webinar is the effects of sodium reduction on food safety and quality. This webinar is the fourth in a series of 7 free webinars. This project is part of a broad IFINS effort to promote the understanding about what's new about the many roles of sodium, including diet, health, consumer preferences, food safety, and quality. This work has been supported by the IFINS Sodium in Foods and Health Implications Committee, and you can learn more about the series by visiting our website at ifins.org. For those of you who are new to IFINS, we are a nonprofit organization that brings together government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science in food safety and nutritional science. We do this through funding of external researchers and utilize a collaborative approach with experts to support positive change across the entire food and beverage ecosystem. So before we get started, I want to cover how you can ask questions during the webinar. This is the first format that you might see. You'll notice an orange arrow at the top that allows you to expand or collapse your control window. When the window is expanded, you can type your comments or questions in the question box. I will note that your questions are only visible to IFINS staff and not to other attendees. The other format that you might see looks like this. Again, we encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address your questions with any remaining time at the end of the webinar. I will note that IFINS is a continuing professional education provider with the Commission on Dietetic Registration. Today's webinar awards 1.5 CPEUs, and a link will be shared after the webinar to access the certificate. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and get into the content of today's webinar. Our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Kathy Glass. Dr. Kathy Glass is a distinguished scientist and associate director of the Food Research Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In this role, she works with the food industry to develop challenge studies to verify food safety based on the control and growth and inactivation. Also at IFINS, we're honored to have Kathy serve as academic advisor to our Food Microbiology Committee. And so with that, I pass the floor over to you, Kathy.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be the lead-off speaker on today's topic for the effect of salt and sodium reduction on the microbial safety of foods. The research in my lab has been primarily funded via research agreements and unrestricted gifts from food manufacturers, ingredient suppliers, and trade organizations. I serve as academic advisor for IFINS Food Microbiology Committee and for ConAgra Brands Food Safety Council. Today's presentation will cover an overview of the critical role that sodium salt has on microbial inhibition, highlight strategies that can be used to reduce salt use in processed foods, and discuss the value of validation studies and predictive models in product development. Then I will switch my focus specifically to the effect of salt in dairy products, give examples where salt reduction has a negative effect on microbial safety, and alternatives that can be incorporated to ensure safety in reduced sodium foods. First of all, salt has been used for millennia to preserve foods. While salt can be used as a sole preservative, in the age of refrigeration, it is more frequently used along with combination of other factors such as pH, moisture, and low levels of antimicrobial ingredients, collectively known as the multiple hurdle concept. The primary mechanism of growth inhibition by salt is by reducing water activity of the food and drawing the water out of the cells by the process of osmosis. If enough salt is added to the microbe's environment and enough water is removed from the cells, the microbe will fail to reproduce or even will die. Now, we need to recognize that various microbes have differences in salt tolerance. Low salt typically allows most microbes to grow, including spoilage microbes that can be competitive to pathogens. On the other hand, some spoilage microbes are inhibited by high salt levels, and the system may actually select for salt-tolerant pathogens. For example, Staph aureus is known to be a poor competitor, but it also is particularly salt-tolerant, along with Listeria, which ranks about second. Now, as alternatives to sodium chloride, there are other sodium-based antimicrobial ingredients that are effective at lower concentrations that can be used as strategies to reduce total sodium content of the food while maintaining food safety. Because of the differences in salt sensitivities of various microbes, Changes in salt levels can influence fermentation that is used as a preservation method. In traditional fermentation of vegetables, such as for pickles, sauerkraut, and kimchi, heavy salting draws moisture out of the plant cell and selects for naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria that convert the sugars to acid. This in turn inhibits growth of pathogens and other spoilage microbes. Modern meat starter cultures are salt tolerant, and therefore salt is added to the batter before the fermentation of sausages without any negative consequences. In contrast, cheese starter cultures are more salt sensitive, and therefore salt is added after curd formation for proper acid production to occur. With high initial salt, less acid is produced. With low salt, more acid is produced. In general, if salt is reduced from traditional levels, other changes to processing or product formulation, such as the addition of antimicrobials, or marked shelf life or storage conditions to alert the consumer may be needed. As noted earlier, some microbes are more salt sensitive than others. Salt concentrations of up to 1.5% have no significant effect on the growth of pathogens. At 2.5% salt, salt-sensitive gram-negative pathogens and non-proteolytic Clostridium botulinum, as well as spoilage Pseudomonas, have longer doubling times. So higher salt has a direct effect on growth inhibition of these microbes. In contrast, concentrations of up to 5% has little effect on extending generation times for salt-tolerant Listeria, staph, and some other spoilage microbes. Now, we think of salt as a growth inhibitor. Changing salt levels can also affect inactivation rates. In general, lower moisture and lower water activity stabilizes the microbe to inactivation processes. But high concentrations of salt as the humectant may actually accelerate inactivation at certain conditions. The actual differences are variable depending upon the food matrix, the target pathogen, the inactivation method, and whether the salt levels are above or below the growth limits for that particular pathogen. Now, in one published study, increasing salt concentrations up to 8.5% in lab media increased the heat resistance of E. coli. But for Salmonella, when salt concentrations exceeded 6%, the pathogen was less heat resistant than at low salt levels. In our lab, we found extremely rapid inactivation of Salmonella in a hydrolyzed vegetable protein matrix with 20% salt. Even at the low heating temperatures of 135 degrees Fahrenheit, the pathogen was quickly killed and having a much shorter D value than products with similar water activities where sucrose was the humectant. Now, we also know that spores of non-proteolytic Clostridium botulinum are inactivated at lower temperatures than for proteolytic strains, and that cooking 10 minutes at 90 degrees Celsius is considered sufficient to kill 6 logs of non-prot spores. Researchers at the Agricultural Research Service reported slower inactivation at low salt levels of 3% than at 1% than at 3%. These findings could in turn affect the temperatures and time needed for a non-prot cook. For high pressure processing, one set of researchers found no difference in Listeria inactivation in a broth system with 1 versus 2% salt or 0 versus 2.5% sodium lactate. However, other researchers found that increasing sodium chloride or potassium chloride concentrations induced barotolerance of Listeria in meats. One study reported a 6 log reduction for ground turkey with no salt, but only a 2.5 log reduction for 1.5% salt and a 1.3 log reduction for 2.5% salt. Once again, these results suggest that processing conditions should be reevaluated when salt concentrations are changed significantly in foods, and do not assume that they will remain the same as what had been previously validated. As discussed by speakers earlier in this week, there is not one solution that fits all food categories. In order to reduce the use of sodium salt, several strategies can be employed to inhibit pathogen growth as an alternative to sodium chloride. One of the swaps that has been implemented is partial substitution of sodium salts with potassium salts. Now, the amount that can be replaced is frequently limited to less than 50% because of the negative impact that potassium salts have on flavor. But as we will see later in this presentation, for equivalent microbial control, the replacement is made on a molar basis rather than on a percentage basis, due to the differences in molecular weight and the differences in the effect on microbial inhibition. Now, because potassium replacement may not be acceptable for all foods, the inhibitory effect of salt can be substituted by increasing the acidity or dropping the pH, or by the addition of synthetic or clean label antimicrobials that contribute lower concentrations of sodium. Now, one caveat is that some of the salt substitutes may not be approved for use in a given food, such as potassium chloride still being considered by FDA to be acceptable in standard of identity cheeses. This table compares the amount of sodium contributed by various sodium-based antimicrobial compounds when added at levels typically used in foods. As an example, sodium nitrite is a powerful antimicrobial against both Clostridium botulinum and Clostridium perfringens, but contributes an extremely low level of sodium to the product. Therefore, a cured deli-style turkey with 156 parts per million of sodium nitrite, but only 1% sodium chloride may have similar or even greater inhibitory properties than an uncured turkey with higher salt levels of 2.5% and, as a result, higher sodium content. Sodium lactate is also effective against both Listeria and Clostridia. But unlike for natural cheeses, the meat industry has had the opportunity to add potassium lactate as a substitute to curtail the contribution of sodium content, as well as ensure safety. Unfortunately, many consumers avoid purchasing foods with chemical sounding names and elect for clean label alternatives. Fortunately, there are commercially available sources of lactate, propionate, and antimicrobial peptides that are derived from cultured sugar or cultured milk products. Vinegar is an alternative to sodium diacetate, and cultured plant extracts can deliver the equivalent of sodium nitrite, sorbic acid, and other antimicrobial compounds. Now, one consideration for product developers is that while these alternatives contribute relatively little sodium compared to salt, they are not sodium-free. Buffered vinegar may or may not have sodium, depending upon whether potassium or sodium hydroxide was used as the buffering agent. As changes are made to the formulation or processing, it is important to have sufficient documentation that biological hazards are controlled. To this end, microbial food challenge studies should be conducted under conditions that mimic the matrix in terms of ingredients, indigenous microbiota, analytical values, and various storage conditions. Now, several countries besides the US have guidelines for challenge studies. And while there are some variations, all recommend intentionally inoculating the matrix with the target microbe, packaging and storing under one or more conditions, and follow the changes in microbial populations for beyond the marked shelf life. Other factors such as growth of spoilage microbes and pH changes are helpful in interpreting the results. A well-designed and executed challenge study will provide the manufacturer with confidence that their product will remain safe under reasonably foreseeable conditions when compared to the standard product. Most challenge studies are commissioned by individual food or food ingredient companies are conducted under very limited conditions and are applicable to only a small portfolio of food formulations. However, challenge study data from more comprehensive studies are used to develop mathematical models that can help product developers evaluate the safety of foods under a greater number of situations. Now, mathematical models are cheaper alternatives to conducting individual challenge studies, certainly accelerate the time to market for new formulations, and are helpful in evaluating process deviations. Personally, I have several favorite online predictive models that I use weekly. But while they are useful, many were developed in lab media rather than in real food products with indigenous microbiota. They may not consider the interaction of food components such as fat, and they frequently do not include the effect of antimicrobials. Therefore, their predictions are good for screening and maybe deciding on experimental design, but they may not be a substitute for validation studies in foods. Now, beyond online models, there are published models in the literature that have been developed in actual food products that may include the use of the antimicrobial ingredients that can be used as salt replacer. However, they require an understanding of the mathematics that are published to convert the model into a format that is easier to use, such as in Excel. But in all cases, it is critical to know that what the exact conditions are and the limits that were used in the model development. Extrapolating beyond the model may result in faulty predictions that may be fail unsafe. Now, with this as the background, I want to shift gears to specifically consider sodium salt in dairy products. Now, first of all, it is impossible to have a sodium-free dairy product because milk itself has 105 milligrams of sodium per 1 cup serving, but it also has 370 milligrams of potassium and 305 milligrams of calcium, which are positive nutrients. Some dairy products, such as yogurt, have no added salt and have similar sodium content as the milk from which it is made. Safety of these products rely on rapid acid development during culturing and acidic pH during cooling and storage. For cheeses, the added starter culture produces acid to expel whey from the curd and reduce moisture. This, in turn, reduces water activity, making it less hospitable for pathogen growth. Because many cheese starter bacteria are salt sensitive, as I mentioned before, salt is added after acid production to further aid syneresis and achieve the final target moisture level. Salt is also important to control additional acid production during storage by the lactic acid bacteria. It further selects for desirable microbes and affects proteolysis and flavor development. Now, in order to make a reduced sodium claim, the sodium content of the product must decrease by at least 25% from the original. If we just remove salt to achieve this goal, we may be also tinkering with safety that consumers associate with traditionally made products. For example, traditional salted butter has sufficiently low water activity that pathogens are unable to grow even at room temperature. Now, while staph can replicate at water activities as low as 0.86, they don't produce enterotoxin at water activities less than a 0.9. Now, if salt levels were reduced and the water activity is increased, some consumers may need to change their habit of keeping butter out at room temperature for extended periods. If the consumer assumes similar stability, we may see sporadic illnesses of staph enterotoxin poisoning from mishandling recontaminated butter. Now, there are no specific minimum salt levels for most cheeses, but as I said earlier, the levels typically used are important for controlling the starter activity, reducing spoilage, and selecting for desirable microbes. Although potassium-based salts are used in a variety of other foods to reduce sodium content, on the dairy side, current standards of identity for most cheese do not allow use of salt substitutes other than for limited exceptions for low sodium cheddar and a low sodium Colby cheese. And these products must bear a label that states potassium chloride is added as a salt substitute. FDA recently proposed to amend 80 standards of identity that will make a path for reduced sodium cheeses made with potassium chloride, and therefore can still maintain safety and quality attributes. Now, as a side note, partial substitution of sodium chloride with potassium chloride has already been studied for its effect on lactic acid bacteria and pathogens in cheese. In 1982, a UW study showed lower counts of staph and staph enterotoxin in an experimental cheddar made with 1.2% mix of potassium chloride, sodium chloride, than if used the equivalent levels of sodium chloride alone. A 1995 study from the same lab reported no major differences in lactic acid bacteria when cheeses were salted with sodium chloride or that equimolar mixture of sodium chloride, potassium chloride. Now, while these data are decades old, they show promise for developing equivalently safe and quality product using potassium chloride as a partial salt substitute. In the remaining time, I want to give you a few more examples of the effect of salt on pathogens and alternatives to ensure the safety of reduced sodium cheeses. Cheese ranks in the top 10 of food categories that contribute to dietary sodium intake, making it a target for sodium reduction. But unlike when salt is substituted with potassium chloride, simply eliminating salt may not provide equivalent level of safety. Studies compared the inactivation of pathogens inoculated into a standard cheddar with 1.8% salt and a reduced sodium cheddar with only 0.7% salt. The intent was to test at both a high pH of a 5.7 and a low pH of a 5.1. But in the case of the low salt cheese, both treatments had lower pHs than what the targets were. And this was due to the greater starter activity, which ultimately can affect quality attributes. Now, regardless, there was little difference in inactivation rate of Listeria between the various treatments because it is salt tolerant. In contrast, for Salmonella, which is more salt sensitive, the standard cheese achieved the target log reduction within 60 days, whereas the low salt version, even though it had lower pH, still had survivors. Now, while neither pathogen grew, the inactivation rate was less in the lower salt version. Now, other than direct addition of dry salt to curd, some cheeses rely on immersion of the blocks of cheese in a high salt brine for 24 hours or perhaps even several days. These vats are open to the environment and can be potentially contaminated with salt-tolerant Listeria or staph. Furthermore, because of environmental concerns of getting rid of high salt used brines, these solutions are maintained and potentially reused for years. If the brine were contaminated, the pathogens could make its way on a cheese and posing a health risk. So brine management programs seek to kill pathogens periodically to reduce the potential for cross-contamination. Hydrogen peroxide addition has been added as a mitigation strategy because it breaks down to water and oxygen and can be easily implemented by small artisan cheesemakers. Now, we initially evaluated conditions to determine where the treatment was effective. This figure is an example of the effect of pH and brine concentration on the efficacy of hydrogen peroxide at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, while 50 parts per million of hydrogen peroxide was not immediately lethal within 1 hour, Listeria was killed during prolonged exposure. Specifically noteworthy to our topic is that the inactivation was greater at the 20% brine than it was at the 10% brine, regardless if the pH was a 4.6 or a 5.2. Processed cheese products were initially developed over 100 years ago and now include a variety of forms such as slices, spreads, sauces, and dips that are marketed worldwide. This offering is a convenient snack used at quick service restaurants, home, school lunches, and as ingredients in recipes. Now, although pasteurization will kill the vegetative pathogens and spoilage microbes, spore-forming pathogens such as Clostridium botulinum can survive in this low-acid canned food. Studies show that processed cheese products are safe to store at room temperature if they are properly formulated. For any given moisture, Clostridium botulinum will not produce toxin if the pH is low enough and the combination of sodium salt and disodium phosphate emulsifier are sufficiently high. If the manufacturer increases the moisture to improve functionality, the total salt must also be increased, or the pH must be increased to maintain or decreased to maintain safety. Now, this figure shows an example from a predictive model that was developed in the 1980s. Formulations to the right of the curve are rendered safe by virtue of the salt content and the pH. For a cheese spread with 52% moisture and a pH of a 5.7, a combination of 4% salt is required to land on the safe side of the curve and make it a shelf-stable product. This formulation results in a calculated sodium content of about 400 milligrams per serving. To achieve a 20% sodium reduction to yield only 320 milligrams of sodium per serving, the total salts would need to shift to the unsafe side of the curve. To compensate, it is necessary to make other changes, such as reducing the pH by 0.2%. Now, while this appears to be an easy fix by just reducing the pH, increasing acidity is met with resistance by consumers, particularly children, who favor a more mild flavor. So to address alternatives to sodium reduction, we studied the effect of replacing sodium salts with potassium salts on the ability of Clostridium botulinum to grow and produce toxin during normal storage. This study had 80 formulations with varying levels of moisture, pH, salt, fat, and sorbic acid levels that were prepared by substituting up to 50% of the sodium-based salts with potassium salts on a molar basis. Products were inoculated with Clostridium botulinum spores, cooked and hot filled, and then tested periodically for botulinum toxin production. Data was then used to develop a predictive model for reduced sodium, low cheese solid products. Now, the two tables shown on this slide provide examples of output from the model to illustrate the effect of sodium reduction and sodium substitution. Under one scenario, the total salt concentration of 4% total salt will yield a calculated 460 milligrams of sodium per 1 ounce serving. When used in combination with 50% moisture and a pH of a 5.4, the toxin production is prevented for 6 months when it's stored at room temperature. However, if the sodium salts were eliminated or reduced to achieve only 290 milligrams of sodium per serving without any other modification, the predicted time for safety is reduced to only 1 month. Now, on the other hand, by substituting the sodium salts with potassium salt on a molar basis, we can retain the same level of safety while still reducing the sodium content. In this example, replacing 50% of the sodium salts with potassium salts decreases the sodium content by half, but also delays toxin production to 52 weeks compared to products with higher sodium content. Now, from this chart, one might think that more potassium replacement is better. Unfortunately, earlier work in our lab showed that a 75% replacement, it was less effective than 50% replacement. So not only is higher potassium substitution not feasible because of flavor considerations, but it also can have a negative effect on shelf stability. Now, while potassium replacement is an option to deliver equivalent safety, another alternative is the addition of no sodium synthetic antimicrobials. Sorbic acid and potassium sorbate are both potent antibotulinum agents. And on this table, we can see the significant effect of adding just 0.1% sorbic acid on extending the time to failure. In this particular case, for a 50% moisture product, it goes from 7 weeks to 88 weeks. For higher moisture or higher pH products, the addition of 0.1% sorbic acid may not be sufficient, and increasing levels to 0.2% may be necessary to achieve shelf life for at room temperature. Now, while sorbate won't make all products bulletproof, it can still only be used as a salt alternative. Not only is sorbate effective against Clostridium botulinum in processed cheese stored at ambient temperatures, but it also delivers extensive protection against listeria in high moisture cheeses. This figure was derived from the food safety and spoilage predictor model for cottage cheese. In this case, reducing the salt by 50% still allows slightly more growth of listeria at refrigeration temperatures than if we use the full salt cottage cheese. But the product has the greatest margin of safety by adding 0.1% sorbic acid, shown in the orange-black line, even with lower salt concentrations. So in summary, sodium content can be reduced safely using reformulation strategies, but changes should be validated with challenge studies. Substitution with potassium-based salts is limited by flavor and functionality, as well as equivalency in microbial inhibition properties. Changes in pH will enhance safety, but may not be desirable or practical for all foods. But the addition of purified antimicrobials can be an effective salt reduction strategy. However, the consumer acceptance of these changes remain a roadblock for product developers. And with this, I'd like to hand this off to Danny for discussion on the effect of sodium reduction in meat products. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Kathy. So next up, our next speaker is going to be Dr. Daniel Unruh. Daniel is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State University. His research focuses on meat science and food safety. Daniel received his master's degree in food science and technology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and completed his PhD work at Kansas State University in food science and industry. So with that, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Glass, for a great overview of the sodium reduction strategies in foods, and particularly in dairy. Today, I'm going to speak to you about the impact of sodium reduction on microbial safety of meat products and consideration during reformulation, with a particular emphasis on emerging technologies and some of the new things that have come to light in the past 8 to 10 years. Most of my work is being supported by a Hatch project, improvement of the quality and safety of meat and poultry products, as well as support from industry partners and trade organizations. So as Dr. Glass alluded, salt and meat have a long history. Salt preservation has been documented in Egypt by at least as early as 3000 BC. And salting as a means of preservation was well understood way back into antiquity. There have been ancient Roman authors, their texts have been uncovered that have wrote about the procedures for salting hams, and the ancient Greek poets would write about salting and sausage making. You can see here on the right panel, this is some paintings about salted food products, duck and birds and fish found in Egypt about 3000 years ago. And really, salting was the standard until the advent of canning and refrigeration in the 20th century, and it was a key part of the evolution of food science and food safety. Now, sodium salt plays three major roles in meat. That's texture, role in terms of texture, in terms of flavor, and in terms of the safety profile. When we talk about texture, adding salt to a meat product is going to improve the water holding capacity. That's going to improve things like juiciness, as well as tenderness and yield. And it's going to give the product that consistent taste and juiciness and flavor that customers expect. That flavor is also further enhanced by the presence of salt. So we have a taste enhancement. Adding salt can inhibit some bitter notes as well as some astringent notes that may come through based upon other ingredient additions. The addition of salt also regulates some of those chemical reactions that are ongoing in a meat product, including protein and lipid hydrolysis and oxidation. So there's a textural and a flavor component to sodium addition that we certainly have to know when we talk about reducing sodium. But of course, the key factor is safety, which is what I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing, because safety is, of course, our #1 priority. We must consider all of these being impacted when we talk about reformulation as well. I want to note that. So achieving meat safety by the use of sodium salt. What are the mechanisms? Well, as previously mentioned, salt in a meat system, as in any other food system, is going to exert a drying effect through osmosis. That drying effect will lower the water activity of the system. So when we lower the water activity, there simply is not enough free water available for microorganisms to grow. That's the primary mechanism. But we also know that salt may limit oxygen solubility. It likely interferes with cellular enzymes, and it also forces microbial cells to spend time generating energy to expend those sodium ions out of the cell. So instead of devoting time to reproducing and growing, those bacterial cells are instead spending time creating a more favorable environment. And so that's a critical part to sodium salt addition as well. And when we look at microorganisms of concern in meat products, we can see that there is a minimum water activity required for growth. So if we know our water activity of our product, we can get a good idea of what type of microbial control we can expect. Everything ranging from as low as 0.86 for Staphylococcus aureus up to Campylobacter jejuni at 0.98. Now, sodium salt is not in a vacuum, right? It's interacting with the food matrix. And the sensitivity of microorganisms to salt is dependent upon those specific food characteristics, both intrinsic and extrinsic properties, such as the product pH, the product's moisture, the temperature at which the product is held, as well as the presence of other antimicrobials. If we were to rely on salt as our sole antimicrobial ingredient, that would require high amounts and probably make the product unpalatable, excuse me. So when we formulate meat products or when we're reformulating meat products, we need to use sodium salt or the presence of other water activity lowering substances to achieve the hurdle concept for preservation and control. So when we think about those characteristics of a product, we refer to this as a hurdle concept. We can refer to them as multiple hurdles that a microorganism would need to overcome to survive and grow in a food product. So to get to the finish line, if you will. Well, when we have these different levels of control, it might be possible for the microorganism to survive certain temperatures, certain pHs, etc. But eventually we want to create a system where a hurdle is too much to overcome. In this example, it's the addition of an antimicrobial. But as we reformulate, we need to think about this concept because we might need to introduce new hurdles to the system if we're reducing sodium salt. We might need to increase the amount of an antimicrobial, make that hurdle a little bit higher. So that's something to consider as we discuss changing the composition of a product to reduce sodium when it comes to food safety. When we look at reducing salt, we can see that there's certainly an impact just generally when we're holding most other factors solid. So this is some modeling that was done by Stringer and Penn. The far left panel shows bacon at pH 5.5, 8 degrees Celsius. And as you can see, the solid lines are lower salt concentrations and the dashed lines are higher salt concentrations. You can see that when we have lower salt, we have much more rapid growth for all species investigated. Most of these are pathogenic species. If we increase the pH, which makes growth a little bit more favorable, we see that the growth rate is increased across the spectrum, but we still see the effect of salt. Finally, in the third panel, in a ham product inoculated with Listeria monocytogenes, we would expect to see that higher salt dictates a higher level of control, but we also see an interaction with sodium nitrite, which can also be a very potent antimicrobial. And in this case, there might be some synergy. And you can see that when you distinguish the green and the blue lines, the green being those with nitrite addition. The left panel again shows nitrite addition at varying levels of salt product. So as we increase the amount of nitrite, as we go along this axis here, we see that as we increase salt content or move up the line, we're having a greater generation time. So we're seeing a faster reproduction of the, slower reproduction when we have a higher salt content and as nitrite increases. The same type of phenomenon can be seen when we use another antimicrobial such as lactate. So we've established that utilizing salt can change the growth parameters of microorganisms in a meat product, and we know that the reduction of salt may influence the safety of the product. So we need to consider those things as we start to talk about some alternatives. And here's some alternatives to develop a healthy, safe, reduced salt meat product. Changing the form and the size of the salt, utilizing salt replacers, utilizing flavor and saltiness enhancement ingredients, as well as emergent processing technologies. Again, as we talk about these, think about if any safety gaps may appear if we remove salt from the equation. The first strategy when reducing salt is to reformulate and reduce by stealth. And that's a stepwise reduction of salt over time, where the reduction is over such a long period of time, it's not noticed by consumers. There is success stories related to this. In 2006 to 2009, backed by a major public health campaign, sodium was reduced in the UK by about 20 to 30% naturally, but that was, while that was achieved over that time period, it was difficult to maintain. You can see that by 2019, statistically speaking, there was no difference in sodium consumption. And this approach is challenging because it's time consuming, right? And it must be industry wise or changing the taste profiles of a whole population. And It also changes palatability, which is a huge limitation. So reducing and reformulating by stealth is probably not the best avenue, but it would be the first one to explore. The next possible technology is to change the salt size, shape, and structure. So we know that if we can make the salt particles smaller, it will dissolve more quickly, which results in a higher taste perception. We can also change the shape of the salt. So salt with a greater surface area has greater solubility in saliva, and it also better binds water and fat. So it's maintaining both the taste profile and the textural profiles that we need in salt. If we can change the salt into microspheres and have a greater surface area of salt, that will also increase sensory perception. We can also change the structure, so we can encapsulate sodium chloride with polymers or with starch, where that is resistant to the moisture in the product but breaks down in saliva. We can also coat with fat. That maintains the salt structure and allows for more of a homogeneous distribution or non-homogeneous distribution, so you get these salt pockets that generate more flavor. Again, if we do this, we can reduce the amount of salt we need to use, but again, we need to consider how that lack of salt could impact microbial safety. The third strategy was alluded to by Dr. Glass, and that's utilizing substitutes. So in this case, we're replacing some or all of the sodium salt with potassium salt, potassium chloride, potassium lactate, calcium, or magnesium. Now, again, we need to substitute the potassium chloride on a molar basis, but we have seen some efficacy when it comes to utilizing calcium and magnesium, especially for color maintenance in the product, as well as maintaining some of those other textural properties. Potassium chloride is the most common of the substitutes, but some have found it to be bitter or metallic tasting. And we know that substitutions greater than 25% may lead to texture defects, to color change, to less consumer acceptability, and that's a gap in that technology. But if we look at the right panel of the slide here, we can see some successes in the literature, where you see different mixtures of sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium chlorides compared back to 100% sodium chloride use. And there aren't differences in terms of the control of bacteria, as well as differences when it comes to the textural and sensorial properties we're looking for. A fourth strategy is mixtures. Mixtures include mixtures of sodium salts, non-sodium salts, and other ingredients, such as maltodextrins, citrates, hydrochloride, etc. In this category, we could also consider the organic acids, the natural products of fermentation. Some of those were mentioned by Dr. Glass earlier. Of course, those all are subject to regulatory approval and proof that they are efficient. But with these mixtures, we can also have some of those similar drawbacks to substitution. Again, texture defects, color changes, perception by the consumer. But mixtures of both the sodium salts and other ingredients may be a positive or a beneficial pathway to go down. The fifth strategy is enhancers. So that's utilizing ingredients such as yeast extracts or hydrolyzed vegetable protein to enhance the perception of sodium in the mouth while maintaining texture. It's creating a more savory environment, which sort of tricks the brain into perceiving more salt as well. We can use monosodium glutamate or MSG to hide or mask potassium chloride's harshness. And we can generate additional flavor via application of amino acids and flavor generation through Maillard reaction. Again, these are great for reducing salt, but something needs to come back in to compensate for microbial control, be that changing product parameters, utilizing another ingredient, or utilizing another technology. The sixth strategy is utilizing alternative or emerging processing technologies. The first I want to speak of is high pressure processing. This is a non-thermal technique where we apply pressure from 200 to 600 megapascals and a mild temperature. It's been shown in the literature that HPP can reduce microbial counts and extend shelf life. HPP has also demonstrated an ability to modify meat proteins and promoting those physiochemical interactions that support texture when salt is removed. So it's sort of compensating for that salt texturally speaking. We do know that results are mixed. Dr. Glass alluded to this, that there are cases, certainly when HPP has been shown to increase tolerance or microbial outgrowth, but I do want to share a few success stories as well. Zhu et al. In 2022 showed that HPP at 200 megapascals in beef sausage reduced overall bacterial counts. It also reduced cooking loss and it increased protein solubility. So they were able to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce salt content by 50% and maintain the same product integrity. Maximenko et al. Took low salt, low phosphate meat samples that had poor textural qualities and subjected them to HPP, and that improved the elasticity, cohesiveness, and gel strength. You can see that here with the control on the left side containing salt and SPP, and the right panel containing the same amounts but following HPP. More of those cross-links and better textural properties. And O'Neill et al. In 2019 demonstrated that HPP in combination with organic acids reduced microbial growth and permitted a salt reduction of nearly half. Another emerging processing technology is pulsed electric field, where a non-thermal electrical pulse is applied at short time intervals. This produces what is known as ohmic heat, but it does not impact product quality. It does cause an irreversible permeability of the cell membrane, which can lead to cell death. In a study by Bott et al., we can see that in a control product with 2% salt, toughness and firmness is similar in a product with 1.2% salt, but if we add a pulsed electric field, we do see some differences in toughness and firmness. However, there is no difference in pH, no difference in yield. Most of the product parameters, this is in beef jerky, were similar amongst all treatments, so the application of PEF didn't impact color or flavor or saltiness, and it also provided microbial control. So pulsed electric field could be an avenue as well for sodium reduction. Ultrasound is a form of vibrational energy produced by a transducer converting electrical energy into acoustic energy, causing cavitation. Cavitation being a production of bubbles that collapse and cause localized high pressure in the food product, as well as some shear forces, shock waves, and turbulence. This is going to disrupt cellular and functional components of membranes and kill microorganisms. Ultrasound can increase salt distribution in meat as well. So there's the microorganism control that we're seeing, as well as increasing distribution, more effective distribution in meat, as well as, again, accounting for some of those textural components as well. In one study, chicken wing portions were inoculated with bacteria, subjected to ultrasound in the presence or without lactic acid for 3 or 6 minutes. And you can see on the right panel that resulted in reduction of bacteria across several species. Finally, some other emerging technologies. Tumbling technology continues to improve, and tumbling can promote the diffusion of salt and result in a better micro reduction. Desalination technology is being explored, and really the combination of technologies may be the most efficient method moving forward. So what are some gaps when we talk about sodium reduction in meat? Where is more technology needed? Well, we need more advanced techniques for preparing those specialized or nano salts. And there's a lot of methods that researchers are exploring. You can see those listed here. New alternative ingredients, some of the ones that Dr. Glass spoke of, combinations of organic acids, etc. Identifying and validating those. Optimizing and improving cost of high pressure processing. Providing additional knowledge and cost optimization on those alternative or emerging technologies. More real-world data on the efficacy of these new emerging technologies. So generating more of that real-world validated data that we can use to support the reduction of salt in concert with these technologies to maintain safety and reduce sodium, as well as cost challenges and customer acceptability. So when we talk about reformulating, when we talk about reducing sodium and maybe instituting a new technology to maintain flavor, to maintain texture, the number one question should always be, how will sodium reduction impact the safety profile of my product? And this should prompt additional questions. How well do I know my product? What is my water activity and pH? Am I certain of it? Have I taken multiple lot measurements to be sure of that? If I reduce salt or another sodium contributing ingredient, should I add or do I need to add another intervention? If I reduce it, do I need to add an alternative ingredient? If I add a sodium reduction strategy, does it confer an antimicrobial effect so I don't need to compensate? Or what is the magnitude of that antimicrobial effect? And then how will I affirm my product's safety? So there's a lot of research, there's a lot of opportunities for sodium reduction in meat products, but I like to think of it as a journey, right? And it's a journey where you have to ask these questions, evaluate these technologies, and do what it takes to generate a safe product, which the end of the journey will hopefully be a challenge study, which is the gold standard for safety, where you prove the safety and you address the greatest gap, that the sodium reduction does not impact your product safety, but can deliver on the textural, flavor, and expectations of the product that customers expect. Appreciate everyone's time today, and I look forward to the rest of the webinar and time for questions and answers.
Awesome, thank you, Daniel. For our last presentation, we have two representatives from Kraft Heinz, Allison Trio and Robert Henney. Allison is a principal scientist at the Kraft Heinz company, where she has held product and ingredient technology development roles over the past 6 years. In her current role in the next generation ingredient science R&D team, she leads Kraft Heinz sodium reduction technology platform. Joining Allison is Bob Henney, a product research and development lead for Kraft Heinz. He leads the product R&D team for tomato-based products. Bob received his Bachelor's of Science degree in food science from Penn State and has worked in the food industry for over 26 years. So with that, welcome Allison and Bob.
Thank you, Caitlin. All right, and yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Caitlin. I'm happy to be here today and be part of this sodium reduction webinar series for my second webinar this week. Thank you to those also joining us today. It's great to have such a big audience. And as Caitlin introduced, my name is Allison Trio, and I'm a principal scientist at the Kraft Heinz company. I lead the sodium reduction technology platform for Kraft Heinz, and as a member of the next generation ingredient science team. The impact of sodium and salt on the food safety and quality attributes of food products is incredibly complex. So I'm excited to be here today and to shed some light on how sodium reduction impacts certain product categories and how it's approached from an industry perspective. Dr. Glass and Dr. Unruh have provided fantastic insights into cheese and meat, and I'll touch on those again, as well as expand into other categories in the Kraft Heinz portfolio from both food safety and food quality perspectives. And before getting into the presentation, I do want to provide disclosures. I'm a committee member of the Sodium in Foods and Health Implications Committee of IFINS, and I'm employed by the Kraft Heinz company. Additionally, any opinions I express today are solely my own and do not express the views or opinions of Kraft Heinz. I'll begin my presentation with an overview of the Kraft Heinz portfolio and highlight a few product categories whose food safety and quality attributes are impacted by sodium or salt. I'll then provide some insights into the challenge study process that Dr. Glass already overviewed as well, employed to confirm the food safety of products that have undergone reformulation. After that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Bob Henney, for a deep dive into the development of no salt added Heinz ketchup and the food safety and quality challenges involved. First, to introduce Kraft Heinz, I want to highlight the many food and beverage product types the company produces. As the third largest food and beverage company in North America and the fifth largest in the world, Kraft Heinz's portfolio is unparalleled when it comes to our powerful and iconic brands, including those that you see here, among many others. This portfolio is complex, including products from sauces and condiments to meat and cheese, to shelf-stable, refrigerated and frozen meals, sides, and kits, to refreshment beverages, coffee, and desserts. These food product categories each have product, packaging, processing, food safety, quality, regulatory, and cross-functional experts to support their portfolios. Additionally, each of these categories is affected differently by salt, and even within these categories, different products each have unique complexities in food safety and quality. I have here examples of just a few of the food product types that Kraft Heinz produces and the different formats of products within each of them. Salt plays a major role in the food safety and quality of these refrigerated and shelf-stable food systems, among others. Within meat, as Dr. Unruh described, salt plays unique roles across deli meats, hot dogs, and bacon due to different types of product attributes targeted, different types of manufacturing steps, and whether the products are ready to eat or need to be cooked. Within cheese, the story is similar, and cheese slices, spreads, sauces, and loaves each have unique recipes and processes to deliver on consumer expectations of these product types. Even in dressings and condiments, salt plays a role across creamy and oil-based dressings, ketchup, barbecue sauce, mayonnaise, and sandwich spreads. While the food safety of each of these products is a factor of many of its attributes, including but not limited to water activity, pH, and preservation ingredients, as well as how it's processed, including handling, cook, and package fill temperatures and pressures, salt levels may be one of the many contributors to a product's overall food safety profile, allowing it to exist in its designed format. Because of this, the reduction of salt in all of these systems can lead to an overall product reoptimization of its recipe in order to maintain its food safety according to the hurdle principle described earlier. Beyond food safety, salt also contributes key quality attributes that consumers expect of these products. Within deli meats, alluded to earlier, salt interacts with protein to create and stabilize the texture, as well as, of course, contributes to the taste and flavor profiles. Further, deli meats also have phosphate salts. These allow for moisture and flavor retention, as well as allow for consumers to easily separate the slices from each other in the package. In cheese, salt again contributes to enhancing the taste and flavor, making cheese what it is. And in processed cheese, the emulsifying salts are what give them their smoothness and creaminess when melted, but their firmness when cold. In dressings, salt enhances taste and flavor while also balancing the entire flavor profile, including the acidity, spices, and in creamy dressings, the dairy flavors. And in condiments, salt does all that it does in dressings, but additionally stabilizes the texture, providing thickness, smoothness, and cohesiveness of a high-quality condiment. In any of these systems, a reduction in salt creates many gaps beyond salty taste. It can require flavor and taste rebalancing, processing solutions, the use of new texturizing solutions as starches, gums, or hydrocolloids, or even the development of novel ingredient technologies in texturizing or preservation ingredients. Once a product is developed or renovated with a reduced sodium level, and the quality has been re-optimized to deliver on expectations, if that product is outside qualified salt ranges for food safety in that product type, challenge studies and full shelf life re-evaluations are required. To reiterate Dr. Glass's overview of challenge studies and citing Eurofins and their microbial challenge testing 101, a microbial challenge study is a laboratory study in which a food product is artificially inoculated with pertinent pathogenic or spoilage microorganisms to determine their behavior in the product and assess whether they present a risk to the microbial safety or quality of that product. Essentially, they're designed to determine the fate of microbiological organisms if they are present in the food matrix. Challenge studies and shelf life tests require significant resources from a consumer packaged goods company, resources through product subject matter experts, SMEs, food safety and microbiology SMEs, production labor, and significant costs ranging from $10,000 to over $100,000 per study, and significant time ranging from 90 days to 52 weeks. Even within qualified salt ranges, some sensitive product types require challenge studies anytime an ingredient is added or removed. Many sodium reduction projects, especially those with large levels of sodium reduction, fit in this description and require challenge studies. Additionally, as you look at different categories, different challenge studies and shelf life tests are required per product, significantly impacting the time to execute sodium reduction reformulations. These can span up to a year, but refrigerated and shelf-stable products have different needs. All of these product types must be confirmed for food safety against various pathogens and spoilage microorganisms, with examples listed here, including Clostridium botulinum, Listeria monocytogenes, Staphylococcus aureus, yeast, and molds, just to name a few. This commercialization timeline overview is an outline of the steps taken at Kraft Heinz as we progress a sodium reduction project from scoping to launch. While exact timing always depends on the product type and the extent of sodium reduction targeted, these are the general process steps necessary to get a sodium reduced product onto the shelf. Due to the complexities involved, it could take up to 3 to 4 years before a high quality sodium reduced product is available in stores. I walked through this slide in Tuesday's webinar on continuous improvement and what manufacturers are doing to reduce sodium in food products. So if you'd like a deeper dive of this and didn't have a chance to join, I would recommend watching that webinar recording once it becomes available. However, I do want to highlight some specific steps in here related to food safety and quality within the commercialization timeline of a sodium reduction project. After the ingredient exploration and evaluation phases to identify sodium reduction solutions from a taste and product performance perspective, around year 2 is where the food safety stability of these test products are confirmed. That's when the challenge studies would be initiated. Only once challenge studies confirm the food safety and quality of a food product will be maintained will a product continue through recipe finalization and become available to consumers down the road. With that, I'm going to conclude my portion of the presentation today and transition this over to Bob to provide a case study example of this commercialization experience within no salt added Heinz ketchup. And thank you all again for joining the webinar today.
Thank you, Allison. My name is Bob Henney. I am the product R&D lead for condiments and sauces team, and my team works on Heinz ketchup and pretty much anything else that utilizes tomatoes as an ingredient. Heinz tomato ketchup is a perfect blend and balance of cooked tomatoes, sweetness, tangy, and spice flavors. A slight adjustment to our recipe can throw off that perfect balance. So we need to be very careful when we reformulate our Heinz ketchup recipes. In 2004, Malcolm Gladwell dissected the concept of amplitude in great detail in his article, The Ketchup Conundrum. Gladwell discovered that amplitude was the word sensory experts use to describe flavors that are well blended and balanced, that bloom in your mouth. No single element of the product's flavor outweighs the rest. Instead, they work together in perfect harmony with our taste buds. And we live by a famous H.J. Heinz quote, "To do common thing uncommonly well brings success." I'm going to present a no salt added Heinz ketchup case study in sodium reduction. The background and objective was to remove the added salt from Heinz ketchup while maintaining the key quality and sensory attributes of our regular Heinz ketchup, our regular Heinz tomato ketchup, Steps to remove the added salt from Heinz ketchup. First, we need to identify alternative salt replacers by reaching out to our procurement team and preferred suppliers. After careful consideration, modified potassium chloride was identified as our salt replacer. Next, we perform lab bench work to determine optimal usage rates. Usually supplier usage rates are a little on the high side. Next, we qualify final formulations in our pilot plant to verify formulation, processing, filling, and analytical information. Then we evaluate usage rates by utilizing quality descriptive analysis, or QDA. Next slide, please. We perform QDA profiling to understand which level of salt replacer may best match the sensory profile of our Heinz regular tomato ketchup. Evaluations were done on appearance, aroma, flavor, texture, mouthfeel, and aftertaste. Our recommendation was to move forward with the percent salt replacer highlighted in red below, as it displays the closest sensory profile to regular Heinz tomato ketchup. The first thing we analyzed was appearance, the shine, how it looks on the host food, smoothness, We don't want to see any visible particulates. We want it to maintain its shape. It must have cling. An example of that is actually the cling to a French fry. The amount of visible fibers. Liquid around the edges are syneresis, brown or dark colors, firmness, thickness and consistency, and red color. Next slide, please. Next, we analyze aroma, the overall ketchup aroma, the vinegar, which is very important for ketchup preservation, brown spices, caramelization, onion, green, pepper, overall spice, and cooked tomato. Next slide, please. Next is the most important. We analyze the flavor. We analyze the over tomato flavor, initial sweetness, salt, initial sourness, tangy, pepper, clove or allspice, green, umami, bitter, metallic, which is sometimes attributed to utilizing potassium chloride, onion, honey, caramelized flavor, brown spice, vinegar, overall spice, maximum sourness, vinegar, maximum sweetness, and cooked tomato. Next slide, please. Next, we analyze the texture of mouthfeel, the cohesiveness as a whole, smoothness, the thickness, the puckering effect, the dissolve rate in your mouth, the pepper burn, the filmy mouth coating, throat burning or mouth drying. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we analyze the aftertaste. Overall tomato flavor, the cooked tomato, saltiness, sweetness, clove or allspice, caramelization, green, onion, honey, sourness, brown spice, the vinegar, overspice, and if there's any kind of lingering aftertaste. Next slide, please. So next, what we do is we actually go to the factory and produce factory trials to ensure the new no salt added product meets our highest quality standards for Heinz ketchup. Once we actually have those samples, we're actually able to perform our challenge testing. Then after that, we actually start our shelf life testing. First, we need enough samples to store at 3 temperatures and take samples periodically until 1 month past the expected shelf life. Storage temperatures, we utilize 3 different chambers. One is refrigerated, one is ambient between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and we also use an accelerated temperature, which is between 85 or 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Next, we perform sensory evaluation every other week for significant and test it for any significant color changes, oxidations, off flavors, viscosity, or syneresis. Then we execute analytical testing, basically during the beginning, middle, and end of the shelf life to make sure we're still within our analytical standards. Then we also, at the very end, we perform microbiological testing to make sure that we do not see any kind of microbial growth during that shelf life process. Last but not least, but very important, we measure the gross weight to make sure that we are meeting our weight targets for the final product. Next slide, please. Actually, this is the last slide, so I'm sorry. Then we start the commercialization process, and it usually takes between 12 and 15 months to commercialize something like this. Basically, the steps for our commercialization process is product and packaging development. We have SKU reservations. We have to update our material and packaging specifications. We have to revise our formulation specifications. We have to update our factory processing sheets. We have to revise our trade specifications for printed packaging. We have to order labels and our corrugate material. We have to activate the SKU. We have to load the BOM or the bill of material. Then we run production. And then we start shipping it to our product distribution centers. That's all I had. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
help if I turned on my microphone. Could the rest of the panel turn on their cameras and we can go through some Q&A? All right, perfect. Well, fascinating presentations, everyone. Really appreciate it. We've got some cool questions in here. Kathy, I think we'll start with you. There's a question about reduced fat cheeses that tend to be higher in sodium. How are these strategies for sodium reductions similar or different from full fat cheeses versus reduced fat cheeses?
Ooh. So if you're talking about, there's a difference between a processed cheese and a natural cheese. And so I think that we've got our processed cheese, the model has been published in 2017. So we know what's going on with that. For a natural cheese, you may want to tune in tomorrow to listen to John Jaggi, who's going to be talking about cheeses tomorrow too. And in that particular case, I know that they're working on other dairy products such as whey permeates to add back into cheeses to bring back the flavor. But with natural cheeses, that is way more complex because you have to do not only the substitution for the flavor, but also as you reduce that salt content, and you might have more growth of that background microbiota. Back in 25 years ago, when we were doing some of our really low-fat processed cheeses, we found that we had a lot of antimicrobial activity due to lactate because the whole system contributed a lot more acid to it. And unless it was a wash curd cheese, that lactic acid got transferred into the processed cheese and it ended up being a safer product. But because of quality issues for natural cheeses, that lactic acid might be washed away for the wash curd and you lose that. So I think that if you're looking at a low fat, low sodium natural cheese, it's really going to depend upon what cheese you're looking at. And you've got, I don't know, 2,000, 1,500 different types of cheeses. So you have to be a little bit more specific with that. There probably isn't a main thing other than you might have to look at different types of starter cultures that can still accomplish the same type of acid production and flavor development in spite of the fact that you don't have that fat in there and because of the low salt in it. So it's much more complicated than a processed cheese, actually. So
sounds like it.
Don't have any answers.
That's fair. There's a couple of meat questions that have come in. So Daniel, how far out do you believe that the novel meat processing technologies are from commercial readiness? And what kind of progress is needed to employ these processes in the industry?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a gradient. If you look at something like high pressure processing, already certainly used across meat and many other industries. And I think there, the main thing is going to be continued cost optimization. As you look at some of those other technologies, some of them have been around in theory for quite some time. I think we might be approaching more of a possibility to have them utilized more frequently, but again, it's going to be cost optimization. It's going to be that cost benefit ratio for producers to install this type of equipment. And so it's sort of a mixed bag. I think as we continue to see customers evolve what they want to see in products, and if they continue to demand these lower sodium type products, there might be more of an impetus to utilize these technologies to create those products. So it might be driven more by market demands.
As most things are. Great. Kathy, another question for you on cheeses. So what further research do you believe is needed in order to advance progress in sodium reduction in natural cheeses?
Okay. Well, I somewhat alluded to that in my previous answer in the fact that not only do we have to worry about the flavor concept, but we also have to think about what is going to be doing for that acid production, which in reality has an effect on the overall quality. So as we saw in some of those figures that in the lower salt cheeses, we had more acid production and the pH dropped down. And sometimes it had a little bit of an effect, but not necessarily. But it definitely will have an effect on quality. So I think what we need more research on is really on the starter culture activities and trying to find things that can be a little bit better controlled, maybe have some that are a little bit more salt sensitive or just have a little bit different characteristics. So I think starter cultures are probably where we really need to go. on that.
Okay, fascinating. We have a question, Daniel, about microsalts. I know, saw in your presentation you mentioned nanosalts, so is this the same thing? What the heck are they, and what's the benefit to sodium reduction?
Yeah, again, so they're similar, right? They might be marketed under different names, but the goal here is just reducing that overall surface area. So if you can make a salt product where, but making them smaller so there's a greater surface area, or flaking as well, it just provides more sensory impact when it's consumed. And so by changing that structure, by making it smaller, you can also have greater dispersion into the product and greater picking up of that salt taste. So that's the goal there, is just to make it smaller so that there's more surface area and so there's more taste on the tongue.
Okay, fascinating. Allison and Bob, we have a question coming in about the commercialization process. So you guys kind of alluded to the high cost during testing. What's needed to drive down these costs of this testing and or accelerate the product development?
That's a good question. At least I'll take a stab at part of this and let Bob extend on it if he would like. From a time perspective, I'm not sure if there's anything that you can cut down on, as you do want to test through your product's shelf life. However, from a cost perspective, it may be possible with, like Dr. Glass mentioned, models. If there are more models, more robust models, it could help in having a better design so that you have a higher likelihood of success later on. But from a individual testing cost, like per variable or time per variable, I'm not sure if there's much that can be done to shorten those or make them more affordable.
And I think from a commercialization process, what we like to do is more testing in our pilot plant, because our pilot plant is actually able to replicate the factory process to a T. And I think, once we get into the plant, we're disrupting their production, and that drives up costs a lot. So we like to do a lot of the testing internally, and like Allison said, we like to utilize a lot more modeling. And as long as a lot of times before you do challenge testing, which Allison mentions, that's very expensive, is if you have a product or a similar product where you're not really changing the analytical values for that, you could actually utilize that product as kind of a guidance.
Fascinating. We have a question about sorbic acid in deli meat. So maybe Daniel, you could tackle this. The question is, does sorbic acid work as effectively as an antimicrobial in deli meats as in dairy products? Maybe Kathy, you might want to cover this as well.
As a matter of fact, we did test with sorbic acid against listeria in meat products a long time ago. Unfortunately, it got left off of the petition to get it approved for use in meat products. So right now, it's not approved for use in meats. But we do have evidence that listeria is controlled if you have sorbic acid levels up to a 0.3%. Once again, it depends upon the moisture and the salt content, things like that, but it does work in an uncured product. As far as other kinds of controls, our guess is that it probably also works against the Clostridia. So if you have extended cooling of a meat product, that's uncured meat product, and you added sorbic acid to it, my guess is that it would be inhibitory to perfringens. Based off of evidence that we have in other food products, it's probably going to be inhibitory to botulinum too. So I think could work. Unfortunately, it's not approved for use.
Anything to add on to that, Daniel?
I couldn't have said it better myself. Excellent.
Awesome. Well, we are just about out of time. I do want to take this time to thank all of our speakers for this fascinating webinar. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too online. I do want to note that there are more webinars in this series, so feel free to go over to the IFINS website to register and learn more about those. You can also check out the website for more ongoing activities that IFINS has. Also take a look at our LinkedIn. We're quite active there. So with that, thank you to all of our speakers, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
Thank you.